Hello everyone and welcome to another video. Today we have a very special guest, Anthony Pompliano, best known as Pomp. Welcome to the channel.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you for the time. So maybe for the Spanish speaking community that don't know you that well, can you briefly introduce yourself?
Yeah, Anthony Pompliano. Most people know me as Pomp. I am an investor and entrepreneur and have been focused on crypto, Bitcoin, blockchain industry for a number of years now. Prior to that, served for a number of years in the U.S. Army, built and sold 2 technology companies, and also ran a number of product and growth teams at both Facebook and Snapchat.
Fantastic. I will put all your information in the description of the video for the people who want to check it out. And Anthony, so I don't want to start with the typical questions that everyone is talking about. I would like to talk about, let's start with DeFi and the evolution of the technology regarding that topic, because the majority of the project, DeFi is a big topic. It's a market that has been created that is going to be the big door for a lot of institutions to come into the space also. So the majority of the projects have been built on the Ethereum blockchain. And I would like to know your thoughts regarding the possibility of building those on top of Bitcoin. And this is also related to sidechains and how the technology is evolving in that sense. What are your thoughts regarding this topic?
Yeah, so the way I think about this is it's kind of a side-by-side comparison, right? In the Bitcoin ecosystem, you have something that's proven to be sound money, but it's surrounded by centralized infrastructure. So all of the exchanges, the wallets, all, the lending products, et cetera, it's all centralized around that sound money. Then when you go to kind of the Ethereum ecosystem, you have decentralized infrastructure. So you have, all the DEXs, you've got all sorts of lending protocols and products and services, et cetera. But then those things are surrounding what looks like a fiat currency, right? ETH is a fiat currency for all intents and purposes in terms of the way that it's structured. And so what ends up happening is you have a mismatch where you need to get that decentralized digital sound money currency with decentralized infrastructure. And so there's 2 ways that can happen. Either you bring Bitcoin to kind of the ETH DeFi world, or you bring the idea of decentralized infrastructure to Bitcoin. We already see people trying to bring Bitcoin to the DeFi space, things like WBTC, TBTC, et cetera. So there's plenty of people who are kind of working on, let's bring Bitcoin into the existing DeFi ecosystem. There's a number of other companies that are actually building decentralized infrastructure for Bitcoin. So rather than bring Bitcoin over, they're actually bringing the infrastructure over. Many of those companies have not yet been announced. We've actually invested in one of them. And it's something where I don't know who's going to win. I have my opinion. I obviously think that building the decentralized infrastructure around Bitcoin is going to be kind of the better long-term strategy. But those are kind of the 2 paths that people are pursuing. And the ultimate goal is, how do you match Bitcoin with decentralized infrastructure in some form or fashion?
Yeah, no, I totally agree with your point. I heard you saying it and I wanted to bring it to the channel. And I think sidechains, for example, is from a technical perspective, a topic that everyone should be following right now. And following this line in terms of technical perspective, what do you think we as an ecosystem, as a market, should be focusing more in terms of the evolution of the technology? Let's say for the following 2 years, what matters most right now?
Yeah, people hate this answer, but it's just time. I tend to think that most of what we are going to see around adoption is going to just be time. And what I mean by that is more people have to learn about Bitcoin. They have to learn about the decentralized infrastructure. They have to have the actual time pass where they get screwed in the legacy system, whether it's through inflation, confiscation, all of the issues that we see in the legacy world. And that stuff takes time. Along with that, developers need time to actually build the products, right? And actually get the things in a place where they can handle millions or tens of millions of people using them. And so time is kind of, to me, one, it's a great answer because I think it's right. But two, also, then what it does is it shifts what's the onus on you, me, and everybody else. It's patience, right? Don't expect this to happen overnight. Don't get frustrated when it doesn't happen overnight. It's going to take some time, and that's okay. That should be expected. And so if you have a patient long-term view, what ends up happening is you now start building the right products rather than just trying to build products that can kind of catch people's attention, in a week or 2 weeks, but then don't make it a year or 2 years.
Okay, the last thing you said, I think I'm going to put a big highlight in the video. Everyone needs to listen to that. So the following question is regarding the digital coins that many countries are coming up with, such as Sweden or China, that is projecting on developing the digital yuan. What are your thoughts on this topic? How do you think it could affect us as an ecosystem? And the second question is, do you think the recession that we are facing right now could help people realizing what Bitcoin is and what it represents finally? Because in 2008, it was too early.
Yeah. So I always say that money doesn't have a technology problem. Money's got a monetary policy problem. And what I mean by that is whether you have the US dollar in the fiat format, like actual physical cash, in an electronic format where it kind of is all in a centralized database, or you digitize it in some way, it's still the US dollar. So it's the same monetary policy. So you're just changing the technology form factor, but the dollar's still the dollar. If you go around the world, same thing. So the problem is not the technology, because when you digitize the dollar, there isn't that big of a difference for most people in the United States, right? Yeah, maybe it's a little bit more accessible to some people around the world or whatever. We don't change that much. All money in the existing world has a monetary policy problem. And so where I think we're going to get is every currency in the world, whether they're digital first or digitally native currencies like Bitcoin, ETH, etc., or they are fiat currencies, they're all going to be digitized. So you're going to have the US dollar and Bitcoin will have very similar digital structure. Some of them might be decentralized, some might be centralized, but they'll all be digital. The competition is going to happen at the monetary policy level. And so now people are going to have a choice. Do I want to put my wealth into the dollar, into the yuan, into the yen, into Bitcoin, into something else? And what I believe is going to happen is when all else is held equal on the technology front and everything is just as accessible as everything else, people will choose Bitcoin because of its transparency and its lack of manipulation in terms of the monetary policy. And so that's a 10, 20 year type time frame, but I ultimately think that's what's going to end up playing out here. And so that's why I spend most of my time, focused on and trying to just wrap my head around how this plays out.
I really hope that happens because here in Argentina, for example, we live in a constant crisis. We have inflation and we are on a way to hyperinflation and the country is going to default. So, and I don't see people taking action and I don't see people studying money. And I'm talking about middle-class people, like people who have internet connection and have those things. So that is, I hope that happens. We don't know when. Human behavior is a thing that we always need to keep in mind, and how humanity is perceiving those values. I think things like a pandemic or a recession of this magnitude need to happen in order for people to wake up. But I'm constantly doubting if that is the case, because here is a disaster and no one is taking action. So we'll see.
Yeah, and I think that a lot of what you end up seeing, right? I've never been to Argentina, so I can't speak to that country specifically, but I think just structurally, this happened in many places around the world where the average person doesn't understand what's happening, right? They don't understand about currencies, devaluation, inflation, none of that makes sense to them, right? Because they just don't have the time to look at it. They don't understand it. They're not interested in it, whatever. What they do know, though, is why did a loaf of bread used to cost, $1 or 1 Bolivar or whatever it is, and now all of a sudden it costs 10, right? It's everything around me is getting more expensive, but I'm not actually making more money. and therefore I can't get ahead. I'm falling behind, right? And that's where the effects of hyperinflation or high levels of inflation are really felt, I think. And so what you end up getting is it's almost like people don't understand the problem, but they are negatively affected by the problem. And so what hopefully will happen, right, the work you're doing and others, is educating them on this is why it's happening, this is how it's actually happening, and here are the options of what you can do to protect yourself, your wealth, and your family.
Yeah, yeah. Well, we will continue with the work. We're here to stay forever, decades to come. So next question is the question that everyone is waiting for. The halving is 1 month away. So price predictions from Pomp for the halving in a short-term perspective and a long-term perspective. Do you think we're going to get to a new all-time high, and when?
Yeah, so I don't know what's going to happen in the short term. I tend to avoid kind of any short-term price predictions just because this is a hyper volatile asset. And then on top of that, you've got this liquidity crisis happening in the macro environment. So kind of all bets are off. But over a long period of time, in long period in Bitcoin terms is like, call it 18 to 20 months, right? So kind of end of 2021, I think Bitcoin will hit $100,000 in US dollar value. And really the reason for that is a combination of the macro environment with the halving structure. And what I mean by that is in the macro environment, especially in the United States, you've got a zero interest rate environment. Other places in the world, you have negative interest rates. So cost of capital is very cheap. You then have massive quantitative easing. In the United States, we've announced $2 trillion in stimulus. There's probably more to come. Japan just approved an almost $1 trillion stimulus plan. There's many other countries around the world that are injecting liquidity into their economies. And so what ends up happening is they're devaluing their currencies. And when that occurs, people are going to seek out inflation hedge assets like gold, Bitcoin, real estate, et cetera. And so right when everyone is running to gold, Bitcoin, real estate, and others, Bitcoin's going to have this supply shock. 50% of the incoming daily supply will disappear. And so if you wanted the price to stay stable, you would have to see a decrease in current demand along with the decrease in incoming supply. At minimum, I don't think you're going to see that. I think you'll continue to see kind of the same level of demand, or more likely, you're going to see an increase in demand over time. And so if you get that increase in demand, but you get a decrease in incoming supply, supply-demand economics take over and you get an increase in price. And so that's where Bitcoin's volatility really comes in, where other assets, if they go up, 4 or 5%, the equivalent in Bitcoin's term of a 4 or 5% increase in like public equities is like a 10 to 20% increase in Bitcoin price, right? That on a kind of historical relative basis. And so to me, it's a thing where Bitcoin has a very binary outcome. It's either worthless or it's going to be worth, millions of dollars a coin at some point in the future. I tend to think that obviously we're going to head towards it being worth a lot more than it is today. And on top of that, I think that after the halving, within the kind of the first 18 months of the halving, give or take, we will see a very material increase in price. My guess is that we'll see kind of $100,000 by the end of December 2021 at a minimum.
Okay. And so for the people who are in the space right now, they have already been here for a while, and those are the people who are here to stay. What are your suggestions in terms of education for these people? Like, what do you personally keep an eye on or keep on educating yourself to have a maximum perspective? Because let's say those people have a basic understanding or an intermediate understanding how the technology works. What are, besides from a technological point of view and from those other macroeconomical factors that could happen or change the current state of the market? What should we keep an eye on?
Yeah, I think that there's a couple of things. So one is definitely the underlying data points, right, or kind of fundamentals, if you will. So things like hash rate, active wallets, transactions, all that kind of stuff is important. Along with that, I also look at what percentage of Bitcoin has been held for 12 months, 24 months, 5 years, et cetera, and not been moved, because those are kind of the long-term strong-handed holders, which are important. Then on top of that, I look at the macro economy, right? And to me, it's this is less about people running to Bitcoin. It's much more about people running from the macroeconomic challenges and problems. And so when that happens, what you need those problems to be surfaced, right? It's no shock to anybody. There's over leverage in the system. it's no shock that the fiat currency that you hold, no matter where you are in the world, continues to lose value year after year in purchasing power terms, right? So what ends up happening is more people get educated about how money works and they go to leave those assets, right? They're running from that. Well, where do you run to? Gold, Bitcoin, real estate, et cetera, right? And so I think that it's less about people running to Bitcoin and more the majority, kind of the main adoption is going to happen, people running away from the macro economy, and they'll seek out something like a Bitcoin as a solution. And then when you look in the bucket of gold, Bitcoin, real estate, et cetera, Bitcoin to me just has the most asymmetric upside, right? It has the ability to increase hundreds of percent at a time, can also go to zero. So you kind of have a full volatility, whereas gold is pretty stable. Yeah, it might increase or decrease in price, but it'll stay pretty stable. Same with real estate. And so if you're, relatively young and you understand money, economics, et cetera, and you want that asymmetric kind of high risk bucket, then Bitcoin's a great thing to put in that bucket for you.
I think with that answer, you answered my next question, which is for the people who are in the space or need to listen to this answer or question one more time. What is Bitcoin for you, and why are we bullish for the long term? You have already answered it, but.
Yeah, to me, I honestly do look at it as wealth protection, right? And so what I think about is every time that I buy Bitcoin, I'm literally taking dollars that lose purchasing power year after year, and I'm converting them to something that is protected. It is a hedge. And so what I go through is a calculation of how much protection do I want versus how much do I want in US dollar cash, right? I'm notorious for I don't make tons of investments personally. I don't own no public equities other than a GBTC in a retirement account. I've got a couple of illiquid kind of private investments in the startup world. I own a little bit of real estate, but other than that, it's cash and Bitcoin. And the thought process there is really just trying to protect, but have liquidity, but have that protection from inflation and any sort of issues in the structural macro market.
Yeah. Perfect. And the last question, Anthony, we're living through two different crises from a health perspective and from an economical perspective. I don't live in the US, but how much time do you think is it going to take us for the economy to recover? Like, how do you see it in the summer or in the fall this year? And usually how much time do we need for the economy to slowly start recovering again?
I think people are very confused right now, and if they are thinking that we are going to have a quick recovery, they've lost their minds. And what I continue to tell people is I don't want to hear anyone talk about a potential recovery until we all get to leave our homes, because it's impossible to have an economic recovery while we're all sitting at home, right? Yeah. And so once we all get out of our homes, then it goes to, well, if you've ever run a business, you can't fire all your employees, right? Send them all home. And then tomorrow say, okay, we're starting up again, call everyone back, have them show up, start your business, and have every customer come in at the same pace and frequency that they were previously. It just doesn't happen that way, right? And so I think that this is going to be a long road to recovery, but I also don't think the worst is over yet, right? I actually think that we're just starting. I think this is going to get a lot worse before it gets better. It wouldn't surprise me to see public equities drop, double-digit percentages from here. It wouldn't surprise me to see, 25 to 50% of U.S. small businesses not make it out of this and continue operations. Current unemployment is somewhere in the 8 to 9.5%, depending on how you count. My guess is that we could see 15% unemployment, very quickly here by the end of this year for sure. And then GDP. I mean, I could easily see 15, 20% drop in GDP this year. And so when you start seeing those numbers, you're like, there's no way that you just have that happen and then turn it back on and have a record year the next year in terms of you have all-time highs in stock markets or anything like that. I just don't see it happening. And so what I continue to tell people is, look, you got to get protected, right? You got to make sure you can weather a storm for 12, 18, 24 months. You've got cash on hand to be able to do that. Just like a business has to be now prepared. How do we survive with $0 in revenue for multiple months? How do you as a family survive with $0 in income, right? And there's not a lot of people in a good position. So you got to do the best you can right now to get in a position where you could withstand something like that. But I definitely don't think that this is going to be a fast recovery. And I also don't think that we've seen the worst of it yet.
Yeah. Are you worried about criminality and people starting to do criminality starting to grow in the US as well?
Yeah, so look, every country is definitely different when it comes to this, right? I joke all the time. I spent a bunch of time in the U.S. Army, and part of the beauty of the United States is the democracy and the personal freedoms, et cetera. But that also leads to less ability for law and order, right? What I mean by that is in the United States, you can't just go pick up random people on the street, right? That's illegal, and it should be illegal. In other countries, you can do that, right? You can literally just pull up and put people in jail and do all kinds of very authoritarian type policing. Well, what happens is you have very little crime, but you also take everyone's personal freedoms, right? No one has the freedom to go do this criminal activity. And so in the United States, we've chosen, I think rightfully so, to give people personal freedom and civil liberties. But what that leads to is they then have the ability to go do criminal activity if they choose. And we kind of retroactively punish them rather than proactively prevent them from doing things. And so when that occurs, you need a police force, right, to provide protection. And then also the individuals have to be protected. Mm-hmm. What we're seeing in the United States that's really interesting, there was a day last week where 18% of the New York Police Department called in sick. So right at a time where you're seeing they're letting some people out of jail who are non-violent offenders, right, because of the coronavirus fears, et cetera, you're then seeing people get desperate. People are losing their jobs. They don't have food, right? All of those things that tend to lead to alcohol and drug abuse, homelessness, criminal activity, et cetera. You then also are seeing 18% of the police force not be able to go into work. And so it kind of has these compounding effects. Now, we haven't seen any sort of like rioting, social unrest, or like true increases in criminal activity. We've actually seen decreases in things like the homicide rate, et cetera. But over time, the longer that this lasts, the more desperate people become, right? And so what I tell folks is like, look, one, you, regardless of whether we're in a crisis or not, you got to be able to take care of yourself and your family. Right. And if you can't do that, then that's a whole different case. If you're waiting on the government to save you or the police department to save you or whatever, good luck. But on top of that, we do need to make sure that those services are available and those police forces, et cetera, are available for people to provide some law and order. And so I don't think we have that problem yet, but 2-3 more months of this, and it's just human nature. People got to eat, right? And I always ask somebody, if you or your family hadn't eaten for 2, 3, 4, 5 days, what would you do? People go do crazy shit, right? And it's out of necessity. And so I think we just got to try to avoid that from happening. And so far, it hasn't happened, which I think is a good thing.
Yeah, that is a good phrase to finish the video. We'll see what happens in third world countries. It is more uncertain and more scary, I would say. But yeah, thank you so much, Pomp, for being here and for your time. I look forward to maybe meet you in any conference that we attend. And I hope the Spanish-speaking community got to know you this time. And yeah, thank you. Thank you.
Absolutely. I appreciate it. I love all the videos you guys put out, and please keep educating folks. You guys are doing a great job, and I'm sure we'll run into each other soon.
Thank you.